Since our current president was elected, hate crimes have increased in the United States. He was inaugurated in February, and that month we had over 1,000 hate crimes. Just that month. Anti-immigrant, black versus white, we have had neo-Nazi marches. We've had all kinds of interesting problems since Mr. Trump has become president of the United States. Racial prejudice is one of the biggest problems we have. It's rampant, it's obvious. I've been around since 1949, and when I was born, there were places in the South that I could go that African Americans couldn't go. And I didn't realize that until we went on a vacation down south. At that point, we were trying to figure out. Of course, we're stupid kids from Indiana, so we had no clue what we were looking at. But we would go into a restaurant, and there'd be 4 restaurants. And we couldn't figure out what the hell was going on. Sometimes there were only 2 restaurants, but then there weren't any African Americans that were allowed to go to that restaurant. It was just bizarre. We had never seen anything like it before. There were always 2 drinking fountains, one for African Americans and one for white people, as strange as that seems. So this has been a really serious problem. Here's a question for you, and this is a question that I asked Marius the other day, and he actually had no answer. This has to do with American Indians. When the Spanish came here, when the Spanish first arrived, they enslaved everybody that they came in contact with, which was primarily the indigenous peoples of the Americas. So that's what happened with, this is a question you won't get at ASU. Okay, so the Spanish were enslaving everybody, and they treated everybody like they were garbage. I mean, everybody like garbage. Not just indigenous peoples, but also Englishmen and Dutchmen and whatnot. They treated everybody bad. Anybody that wasn't Catholic, they treated very, very brutally. So they enslaved people. So when the English came over and they settled farther north, they settled in Virginia and Massachusetts. Why didn't they enslave the indigenous people? We talk about slavery in the United States, and this is really a serious problem. We talk about slavery in the United States.
Why didn't the Spanish enslave the indigenous?
No, they did. They enslaved the indigenous people. But the English didn't. The English only enslaved Africans. You've got one of the lenses is dark and the other one is...
Oh yeah, they're transitioning.
It's driving me crazy, but that's okay. So I'm just curious. Can you think of any reason why that would be? Why the English found it untenable to enslave American Indians, but the Spanish did? Why didn't they just enslave everybody?
I think they probably saw slavery of African Americans on the other side of the continent, and then when they came here, they saw more populated indigenous people. Where
who are we talking about? The Spanish?
The Indians.
Wait. Let's go back. Okay. Start all over again.
The British probably didn't enslave the African Americans because
they did enslave the African Americans.
So they probably saw that because they did. Let me see here. Now you got me. The British didn't enslave the indigenous people because they didn't see that on where their continent was, their continent that they came from. So they saw a lot of African Americans enslaved. So it's probably used to them to see African Americans enslaved.
Why not the indigenous peoples? They did that in Australia.
I think because with the African Americans, when they brought them over and everything, their body structure was a lot different. Well, I mean, if you look at it,
The
they,
pictures they painted of you guys when they first got over here, my God.
You
Well-
thought they were pornographic pictures.
well, I mean, their body structure, they were like big, burly people.
So were you guys.
We weren't that big. We
Oh,
were-
yeah.
There's
Oh, you were much bigger than the Europeans. They were jealous of you guys.
So the part of it I was going to get to too, that was where, you know, where the indigenous people, they already knew the land, so even though they're captured, they can get away.
They
and
can
just-
get away easily.
And they already know other tribes around them to where they can.
Right.
You know, so it was just like it was no use. They were just losing money even though we were enslaved. They were enslaved.
The Spanish were able to do it though, but the English weren't. Write all this down so you can ask your ASU people.
Since they're so much smarter than we are.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
You
Now-
got me stopped where the Spanish used slavery. So I'm thinking about that part again.
They would capture whole villages and then enslave the entire village. And then they would force them to build cathedrals or whatever, you know, that's what, you know, the Acoma and Laguna, you know, that's what all these pueblos, one of the reasons that they were able to capture all these people. But they didn't just do it up here, they also did it down in Central America and South America. They made them dig for gold, they made them dig for silver. One of the reasons they made so much money, they were mining all this gold out of the mountains, out of the Andes. All this gold and silver, where the hell did it come from? Well, they had all this slave labor that they would just, you know, they'd kill them. They would work them to death. Now, it makes more sense, I mean, if we're talking about money, and of course, we are talking about European money. Okay, so we are talking about money. The Africans were a lot more expensive than the indigenous peoples would have been. Now, the excuse that they give, the excuse that you read in history books, is that was the very reason that you're talking about now. It was the fact that it was difficult to enslave them. If they tried to enslave them, they would just, sometimes they commit suicide. They didn't last for very long, and they could escape very, very easily. But of course, Africans escaped relatively easily as well. The question was, what happened to them? Well, there's a whole tribe of indigenous people and African mixed down in North Carolina. I'm trying to think what they are. Wait a second. They're not recognized as an Indian tribe. Who are those guys down in, I can't think of them. They're one of the largest tribes in the United States. It's just a thought. I mean, it's just a thought. So the English, they weren't able to do that. But the Spanish were able to do that and make tons and tons of money off of it. But the English decided that they would transport, at their own expense, they would transport all these Africans from Africa. So it took them an extended length of time. Anyway, the prejudice that it created in the United States was rampant. The reality is that prejudice exists for everybody. They were prejudiced against everybody. If you were English, you didn't like Germans. If you were Germans, you didn't like Irish. If you were Irish, you didn't like Polish people. And nobody liked the Italians. You know, it was that kind of a deal. So it wasn't just people of color that they didn't like. They didn't like each other. You know, they didn't like people from other countries. And for the longest time in the United States, of course, they weren't allowed to intermarry with other groups. So Englishmen married other Englishmen, not men, other English women. And Germans married Germans, and it was just that way. So we've had this idea, this xenophobia in the United States, where select individuals were denigrated. And of course, people of color were easily recognizable, and therefore, if you're African American, that was a real serious problem. If you're indigenous, that was a serious problem.
You know what I'm noticing is up in Canada, up in Alberta, I don't know if it's in the other provinces, but I'm noticing there's a lot of racism towards the Native Americans right now. Like the other day on Facebook, this white guy, he captured a photo of this native man from the Siksika tribe with his daughter, and they were on a boat in St. Mary's, and he put MMIW, future MMIW. That means future missing murdered Indigenous woman.
Wow.
And so, you know, I was thinking, oh my God, it's really getting bad up there. And my sister said she went to Walmart in Lethbridge, and there was white people yelling at her, calling her a prairie, Nigger, you know, and
Wow.
she said it's just really gotten bad over there. And, you know, that same way in Montana too, you know. I mean, prejudice is really bad up north.
Yes, it is. But I think it's especially bad in Canada.
I thought that Canadians, I mean,
They're
like,
mean.
like, I know they put everybody on the reserves and everything, and, you know, they, like, try to culturally put them into the Catholic system, you know, but
Right.
I thought that Canadian natives got along with the French, you know?
There are more, let's see, how does this work? When we talk about trafficking in Canada, when they talk about trafficking, they're talking about trafficking Indigenous women. That's MMIW. They traffic Indigenous people. But they did the same thing in Australia with the Aborigines. They traffic those women as well. It's people of English descent, like the Canadians and the Australians, they see Indigenous peoples in a negative light. And so they see that they can do anything they want with them, and including make them prostitutes. And that's what is continuing to happen in Canada, and it also happens down in Australia. But it's really serious up in Canada. It's like half of the trafficked women in Canada are Indigenous. And it's like 7% of the population, but half of the women are Indigenous. It's not the same way down here, of course not.
You know, they have a road up in Canada, it's called the Red Road, and since the 70s, there has been so many Native American women that have gone missing on that road. You know, I don't know if they're hitchhiking or what's going on,
Right.
but, you know, they call that the Red Road.
It's just a tragic situation, and it's a different mindset. We like to pretend that the Canadians are like Americans, but the reality is they're not at all. They have a totally different mindset than we do.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's negative, and sometimes it's more positive. Extremely competitive people. You have to be real careful if you tangle with a Canadian, because they'll take you out just to win. Like my knee, I don't have a left knee because of a Canadian first baseman. Okay, so what are we talking about? So racial separations, it's been a really serious problem, and it's been around since the beginning of the not the United States, but of the European settlement in this area. And potentially the Spanish were worse than the English, but you know, we're talking about two really, really negative situations. The Spanish wouldn't allow this is really kind of interesting because Dr. Lerma, his ancestry is a native tribe down in Mexico. But the Spanish didn't want them to even admit that they were indigenous. They just wanted them to call themselves Mexicans. And they've had this indigenous uprising in Mexico over the last 20 or 30 years. Where these individuals who were denigrated and were taught not to consider themselves native or indigenous are now rising up and claiming their ancestry. Whereas the Catholic Church, the Mexican government, the Spanish before that, they wouldn't allow them to do that.
What was his tribe called again? Bobo or something like that?
I can't remember. It's something that starts with a P. But it's a tribe that I had never heard of before, but they're right on the Mexican border.
I met him this weekend.
Oh, there you
he's
go.
a
Nice guy.
person, Yeah.
Yeah. He's not very tall. No, he's skinny. He's skinny. Okay, so we've had racial problems in this area for over 400 years, ever since the Europeans got here. But the reality is, of course, you guys were fighting against each other before Europeans got here, right? Weren't you? You had friends and you had enemies, and okay, allies and enemies. All right. Serious problem. Between the Civil War and Civil Rights, of course, this is what it looked like. This is the water for colored people. They had colored bathrooms, and they had white bathrooms, as I told you. And we saw this into the 1960s. Same thing. If you're African American, there's a certain place that you had to go. This is the colored waiting room. This is a colored admission up in the balcony and whatnot. Anyway, the reality of living in the South before civil rights took hold. 1998, 7,489 hate crimes incidents occurred in the United States, 7,489. 1997 Gallup poll showed that half of African Americans had experienced some form of prejudice within the previous 30 days. In the same time frame, 10% of whites showed outward disdain for blacks. This is in 1997. Wasn't that long ago. Well, I guess it was that long ago. It's 20 years ago. Okay. Have things changed? Are things better since we've elected an African American president?
Yeah.
Or was there a backlash because we elected an African American president? If we hadn't elected Barack Obama, would we have elected Donald Trump? Is he a backlash? Was he a backlash vote? Did people vote for him because they were so upset about Barack Obama being president?
I think they did.
Yeah, some people may have. It's kind of an interesting problem. You would think things would get better. Things should be getting better. But of course, we've had more hate crimes, especially anti-Muslim crimes, hate crimes in the United States. Of the three most numerous minorities in the United States, blacks tend to suffer the most severe racial discrimination. So this 1997 Gallup poll found that African Americans experienced, there were over half of African Americans had experienced some form of prejudice in the last 30 days. How about you guys? Last 30 days, has anybody picked on you because you were Native? So you've experienced prejudice in the last 30 days?
I have.
Farmington.
Farmington? Oh. Nope. Francis is good. Travis was in Farmington, which is not the place to go, evidently. Nothing? You're good? Okay. You did?
I have experienced it here. Because I'm Blackfeet and I'm not Navajo. So Navajos will come into my office and pick on me all the time.
Is that right? Are they
yes.
teasing you or is it
No,
real?
they're like calling me Mexican and
Wow.
no, I think they're teasing me, but I mean, like my husband picks on me every single day, for being a different Indian.
You understand that he married you?
Yeah,
Okay,
I understand
he selected.
that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does it make any sense that he would pick on her for not being the same as him? Did you know that? Did he look at you and say, "Oh"?
And then he'll
She's a
tell
cute
my
girl.
kids, like, I don't know, I'm not too sure what your mom is, I'm not really too sure, but she says she's Blackfeet, but her mom's Mexican, and then her dad says I'm gonna say the other two, but yeah. So, says all kinds of crazy things.
This is a sad story. How about you, Edison? How you doing? Over the last 30 days? Everything's good? Okay. Okay, so 2 out of 5 of you. I guess that's not too bad. That's not too bad. It's almost half. Could have been half. All right. Federal FBI statistics on hate crimes. Let me see if this thing will come up. It's coming out. Wait a minute. Don't I have to turn this off?
Is that like her exam?
Wait a minute. Let me go back. Okay. I need to turn this off. All right. Turn this off. And then I go here, but I can't go here, can I? It's not gonna work. All right, it's not gonna work. It's not gonna work. It's my fault. Anyway, so if we saw the hate crime statistics, really kind of fascinating. There were 6,121 hate crimes reported in 2016. Of course, we saw 7,800 and some in 1997. After the Trump election, there were over 1,000 hate crimes a month in the first 6 months of 2017. It's gone down. There aren't nearly that many. Remember, we had the one rally in Charlottesville. It was a neo-Nazi rally, right-wing rally, and some individual decided he was going to drive his car. Another guy from Illinois decided he was going to drive his car into a group of anti-fascists. What is a fascist? Who are the fascists? If you watch Fox News, they talk about the Antifa all the time. Anti-fascists. So who were the fascists? We need to know this because these are two groups that we are suddenly coming in contact with. The fascists and the anti-fascists. So who are the fascists?
Trump.
Are they good guys or are they bad guys?
The bad guys.
Who in history can we point to as a fascist? Who were fascists? Mussolini was a fascist, but who cares about Mussolini? He couldn't project his power. However, because he was a fascist and because he took power, somebody else took power. That guy's name was Adolf Hitler. The Nazis were fascists. There was a leader in Spain, and actually, if you watch National Geographic, over the next couple days, they have a movie about Picasso, and Picasso was anti-fascist.
How about James Comey?
Who? James Commoner?
Yeah, James Comey. Is he a fascist?
I think so.
Is Donald Trump a fascist?
I would rather not say. If he is, he doesn't claim to be. But he does adhere to a television, a news program that seem to be relatively pro-fascist, or at least anti-fascist.
He probably paid him off.
Who did? Okay. Fascinating stuff, anti-fascist. So the Antifa, the anti-fascists, were the ones that were marching against the neo-Nazis and the white supremacists in Charlottesville. And of course, if you remember, right after it happened, what did Donald Trump say about what was going on in Charlottesville? He said both groups have their positives and negatives. That's what he said. So he didn't condemn either the fascists or the anti-fascists. But he also didn't support either the fascists or the anti-fascists. So if we're talking about prejudice, which one supports hate? They seem to, yeah. They're white supremacists, they're neo-Nazis, yeah. They seem to support hate more than the anti-fascists. The anti-fascists are just against them. As curious as that is, we don't know how many hate crimes we had in 2017.
What if you replace you say that neo-Nazis are fascists? What if other racial groups or other groups like the Black Panther
The Black Panthers? Okay.
or AIM groups.
Right, but they're not fascist. Fascism is a centralized concept. It's a centralized government where all the control comes from one group. That's fascism. Democracy, of course, it's spread out all over. But the fascists, and the interesting thing about the Nazis, they were anti-communist, but they referred to themselves as socialists. And the reason they referred to themselves as socialists is because they were trying to fool the people into voting for them in Germany. So it was really kind of interesting. They called themselves the National Socialist Party. But the reality was, of course, they weren't socialists at all. You can write that one down if you want. Okay, so there are other hate groups, like the Black Panthers. You said the Black Panthers. But of course, the Black Panthers aren't, at this point in our history, the Black Panthers aren't preaching against a select group. They're not a hate group at this point. Maybe in their inception, during the Civil Rights Movement, they could be considered a hate group, but not anymore. They're hardly out there at all, and they're mostly preaching pride, black pride. So, while blatant racial prejudice seems to be declining, it seems that it is being replaced by automatic emotional reaction. And of course, that's what we're getting from the right wing at this point. Individuals low in prejudice consciously try to suppress prejudicial thoughts and feelings. Individuals high in prejudice merely maintain their prejudiced thoughts and feelings. So most of this has to do with the way that you're raised, what you're told when you were raised, when you were growing up. So if you were told that all Asians were horrible, which is one of the things that I was told when I was a child, mainly because they bombed Pearl Harbor. Well, they didn't bomb Pearl Harbor. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. They just happened to be Asians. There were also good guys. There were Koreans, of course. There were bad Koreans and good Koreans. North Koreans were the bad guys, and the South Koreans were the good guys. We fought wars against these people, and Southern Koreans were good. South Koreans were good, and North Koreans were bad. The Chinese were kind of confusing because during World War II they were our allies. What happened after World War II? Do you remember what happened after World War II to China? The Chinese were our allies. They were the Kuomintang, the nationalist Chinese were our allies, and they helped us win World War II, kind of in an odd sort of way. But after the war, a revolution broke out in China, and the communists took over. And the nationalist government fled to Taiwan. So from 1948, when the communists took over, until 1972, when we normalized relations with the Communist Party, we pretended that that China was this little island just south of the Chinese mainland. And we pretended that those billions of people that lived on mainland China didn't exist. And we didn't recognize the Red Chinese. People's Republic of China. You think I'm kidding? I've got a dictionary, I've got an encyclopedia at my parents' house that when you talk about China, when you open it up to China, it doesn't show you the country of China, it shows you the island of Taiwan. We didn't recognize their government, therefore they didn't exist. So we pretended that they didn't exist for over 20 years, as odd as that may seem. And they represented 1.2 billion people. And we pretended that they weren't actually there. As stupid as that sounds. Why am I talking about all this? Oh, the automatic, okay. So my dad hated chop suey, okay? So we didn't have Chinese food at my house because my dad hated the Chinese. Now the odd thing was, when he fought in World War II, he fought in Germany. But he didn't hate the Germans. Well, he did to some extent, but he didn't. He hated the Japanese more because they bombed Pearl Harbor. Individuals low in prejudice consciously try to suppress prejudicial thoughts and feelings. People may maintain a dual attitude system where they consciously control their prejudicial thoughts, But they may maintain automatic habitual dislike from childhood, and of course, that is one of the problems that we have. We have to wait for people to die before prejudices will go away. So if you grew up with a prejudice, the only way for that to go away is for you to die. You can't change that. That will always be in your mind, in your heart. The other thing my parents taught me was that everybody's the same. Well, most people don't teach their children that everybody's equal. Most people teach you that, or most parents teach you that there are good people and there are bad people. But my parents didn't teach me that. So I guess I missed that message. However, once I started school, I found out that there were some people that people liked and other people that people didn't like. I was shocked, because as far as I was concerned, everybody was the same. I looked at people and I didn't see any difference between somebody that looks like this and somebody that looks like me. I didn't see any difference. Their hair's a little curlier, big deal. He's got a better suntan than I do, big deal. It doesn't make any difference. That's the way I was taught. And it kind of screwed me up. Or it could have screwed me up. But eventually my parents, what they were teaching became the way that everybody wanted to be taught. That everybody was the same. I mean, that's what the Constitution says. We're all created equal. While racial attitudes are based on xenophobia and otherness, gender prejudice is based on gender stereotypes that tend to be based on cultural understanding. So each culture has their own way of teaching you about gender. Women do this, men do that. This is what a woman is, this is what a man is. Each culture does that. Whether you live in India, whether you live in Sri Lanka, whether you live in England, we all have our different ideas as to how, who women are and who men are. And this gets kind of interesting. Everybody has at least one female relative. Everybody recognizes at least one female relative, and that's your mother. If you don't have any sisters, then that's no big deal. If you didn't grow up with your grandparents, then who cares? But everybody has one female relative. So it's really hard for people to be prejudiced against women. But of course, it does exist. Sexism was very real. I grew up in the 1950s, and in the 1950s, we saw advertisements that looked like this. They're trying to sell pants. As strange as that may seem, but where's the woman? She's a rug that the man is walking all over. Seems like a negative thing to say. That's not right. Here's another one. Is it always illegal to kill a woman? It's always illegal to kill just about anybody, okay? No matter who you want to kill. But I guess it's okay if we kill women if they're being... This is a computer. You bet your sweet telex operator it is. Okay. Whoops, I went the wrong direction. You mean a woman can open it? I catch it, Bobby.
The top lips can.
I don't understand this one at all. I'm not exactly sure where women belong, but I don't think they belong with your shoes. I don't know. This one doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Keep her where she belongs, because you buy really nice shoes. I really don't understand that one. I'm hoping I don't understand that one. Of course, we don't. Spousal abuse is frowned upon. But here we have an advertisement, Chase and Sanborn Coffee, which they don't make anymore, by the way. Okay. Anyway. This is from the 1950s. There you go. Van Heusen ties. Shows women that it's a man's world. She's on her knees giving him breakfast, feeding him breakfast. My goodness gracious, how stupid is this? This is the crap that I grew up with, okay? There you go. If I ever bought my wife an appliance for Christmas, she would have killed me. dead. I would not be here today if I ever bought her a toaster, a coffee maker, a waffle maker, a skillet. Oh my God, my wife would murder me. And of course, she drives as well as I do, but here we have a Volkswagen. Sooner or later, your wife will drive home one of the best reasons for owning a Volkswagen, because she doesn't drive very well, as strange as that may seem. And this one confuses me a lot. I don't know why. If you blow in somebody's face with a cigar, it's going to make her follow you. But evidently that's what happens if you smoke these cigars. Gender prejudice, one of the insidious aspects of gender prejudice is that females tend to maintain strong female stereotypes just as readily as men do. And the reality is that women support traditions just like men do. There is a question about female circumcision. And it comes up from time to time. It's never been practiced in the United States. Well, actually, it has been practiced in the United States, but it hasn't been advertised. People from select portions of Africa will circumcise their females in one way or another. You've probably heard about it. They want you to be upset about it. The reality is that, who's doing the circumcision? Who's doing the ceremonies to circumcise these young ladies?
And then,
You would like to think so, wouldn't you? I mean, it makes sense. That way you can hate all men, or hate those men, or something. But the reality is, it's the women. They're doing the circumcision, which is kind of a I mean, it's a strange thing to do. But if it's the women that are doing it, they're supporting this. It makes it a little bit different. I had a Nigerian student when I was when I was teaching in Oklahoma City. I had a Nigerian student, and he said, "You know, I would never marry an American because they're dirty." I said, "What are you talking about?" He says, "Well, they're not clean, and I know they're not clean because they're not circumcised." Really? I mean, what kind of an idiot are you? That's what I was thinking, of course. But I asked him about it, and he said that he's a Christian. He's a Christian, but in his culture, if a woman's not circumcised, then they're dirty. They're considered dirty. It's really kind of odd. And who was doing the circumcising? It was the women that were doing the circumcising. The men, of course, were the ones that wanted their women to be circumcised. But it was the women that were doing the circumcising.
Isn't Nigeria, isn't it like a big city though?
Nigeria is a relatively large country. It has more people than any other country in Africa. So it's the most populous country in Africa. Lagos is their capital city.
We have a student that's from Nigeria that lives here right now. And he taught, and then we have a student that's from Kenya. And they taught, but they're not from the same,
Tribe.
Yeah, the same tribe and everything,
Right.
but they relate to one another.
Because they're both African.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, don't ask them about circumcision.
No, I won't.
Probably be a mistake. And the only reason I'm talking about this is because the reality is that when something is traditional, when something is acceptable, that it's women will support this as much as the men will. The women it's just recently, last week as a matter of fact, there was a moral policeman woman in Iran who tried to arrest a woman because her hijab wasn't tight enough. It was loose on her head, so it showed her hair. I know you're as shocked as I was. But the whole point was, it wasn't a male policeman that was telling this woman. It was a female policeman that was, you know, shaking her finger and screaming at this lady. And now it has become an international incident. But it was the women who are supporting these things. So it's, you know, women can have as strong ideas as men can, and they can be just as traditional as men are. And actually, that can be a problem as well. Attitudes toward women have changed as rapidly about women as the attitudes dealing with racial discrimination. My sister, as I think I told you the story, my sister was a feminist in the late 1950s, early 1960s. She marched for women's rights. She was one of the founding members of NOW, National Organization for Women, and she was trying to get things changed. At the time, of course, there was a movement in the United States in the 1960s and the late 1950s, early 1960s to not allow women to vote. Remember, women got the vote in 1920. Well, there were a lot of individuals that thought it was skewing the culture in the United States, and they wanted to keep women from voting. However, most women do not feel discriminated against. That is something that happens to someone else. So no matter who they are. Actually, there are women who are very, very conservative, and they have very conservative ideas. If you want to talk about presidents, we have Richard Nixon would not allow a woman who was not in a dress in his presence. So if a female reporter came in slacks, he would kick them out of the press conference. He wouldn't allow them in his presence. As interesting as that is. And things have changed. Obviously things have changed. This Me Too movement in the United States is really kind of fascinating because it wasn't more than 10 or 15 years ago that these individuals were being overlooked. Nobody really cared that this man was sexually harassing this woman. For years, Bill Cosby got away with what Bill Cosby got away with, and everybody turned a blind eye, despite the fact they knew what was going on. They still turned a blind eye to what he was doing because he was famous, because he was wealthy, because he was America's father. They were turning a blind eye to what happened. We see the same thing with all these television producers, these movie producers. These individuals were harassing women, sexually harassing women, and people turned a blind eye because they were wealthy and important. And of course, we see the same thing with actors, select actors. It seems kind of silly to talk about Marlon Brando and how he treated women. Because he came from a totally different era. But now, of course, people are coming out. Who just went into intensive care? George Bush, H.W., the old 41, just went into intensive care. But people were accusing him of touching them inappropriately when he was in his wheelchair, which seems kind of interesting to me. Anyway, and I'm not saying that this shouldn't happen, but what I'm saying is we're looking at different eras where people are treated differently. And if we want to see how advertisers saw women back in the 1950s, all we have to do is look at these advertisements. Women were sex objects back in the 1950s and 1960s. They were considered sex objects to be punished or killed, for that matter. As odd, they're not really going to kill her. That's just a joke. Really strange advertisements, but this is the way it was back in the 50s and 60s. So women had a huge hurdle to get over, and the huge hurdle had to do with the gender discrimination that was taking place at that time. And it's much worse than you may understand what it was. These are advertisements. These were in national magazines. These were on television. Well, not on television, but they were in national magazines, showing women as subordinate to men. And that was the culture that we were dealing with. of course, gender prejudice, we're talking about the United States and democratic Western countries. Around the world, we find that 2/3 of the world's unschooled children are girls. In Saudi Arabia, women are forbidden to drive. I think they just passed a law allowing them to drive, but they can only drive with a male in the car.
Can they have a cell phone?
I think so. I've seen Saudi Arabian women with cell phones. Women had to sit in the back seat. They couldn't sit in the front seat with the man. That's too, I don't know, sexually provocative or something. But now they can drive, but I think they have to have a man in the car when they drive, if I'm not mistaken. The Taliban in Afghanistan would not allow women to go to school or have any money. They flogged, terrorized, and left them physically and mentally ill. Of course, Amalia, the girl that is an international celebrity, of course, was shot by the Taliban because she wanted to go to school. They shot her in the head. They didn't kill her, of course. They didn't really do very much damage to her head, strangely. But of course, she had to go to England and have surgery done. But it was the Taliban that were trying to keep her from going to school because they don't believe in educating females. It is estimated that 76 million females have been lost in China and India through selective abortions and infanticide since population control has been enacted. If you read the history of China, this has been going on for eons. The Chinese, I'm just reading a novel right now about China. This lady, it's about a lady that she keeps getting pregnant and she keeps having girl children. So she has to have a boy child in order, or she has insulted the family. That's the idea. This is from back in the 1920s. It turns out that her husband is impotent. He cannot produce children. And here she keeps producing child after child after child after child. She has to find someone to make babies with her so that she can produce a male child for this family. What was it? Okay. So that she can make a male child for this family. She has 8 female children. And finally, the second twin is a male. So the 8th child is a female, and then the 9th child is a male. And so he's treated like a little prince by all 8 of his sisters, and by his mother, and by his family. But they would do this. They would sometimes just lose the female children. They would just fall off the boats. The boat people of China, they would tie the male children to the mast, but they would not tie the female children. And very often the female children would just fall off the boat and nobody would care. You think I'm kidding? I wish I were kidding, but it's true. This is the way they did things. And in India, it was the same way. When they had population control in India and China, of course, you were only allowed to have 1 or 2 children. In India, you were allowed to have 2, and in China, you're allowed to have 1. Well, if we look at the population now, it's like 58, 59% male, and the rest are female, of course. But there were individuals, if they had a child, they wanted that child to be male. So they would lose the child, they would abort the child if they knew it was a female. And for that reason, the Chinese government passed a law that they couldn't have sonograms done. So they couldn't find out whether it was a male or female child. But they had a way of divining whether it was a male or female child. The reality is that you carry a female child differently than you carry a male child. So you can look at somebody's pregnancy and tell whether they are male, whether the child is a male or a female child. Of course, the women of Saudi Arabia, they have to wear burqas. And of course, it covers all their body. This lady's showing a little bit of ankle, and this is probably a little bit risque. She doesn't have her face covered. This is really kind of interesting. If you look at her, the way she's walking, she actually has pants on that go all the way down to her ankles. And of course, black is very becoming to everyone. There's a Westerner who has restaurants. For females to eat, they can't eat in front of other males, so they have to have curtains for the females, where the females can eat. This is like a McDonald's, so they can't just eat out in the open. Females can't eat in front of males. It's too sexually provocative, as odd as that may seem. That's just something I found. Unequal status breeds prejudice, of course. From time immemorial, masters have rationalized slavery by viewing their slaves as lazy, irresponsible, and lacking ambition. Though it is economic inequalities that create the social inequality. Those in power justify their wealth and power by stereotyping those without as lacking the drive for success. And if you watch Sean Hannity, I was just reading some of the things that he has said. If you watch Sean Hannity, this is what he says about people that are of a lower socioeconomic status. He calls them lazy. If they had the drive, they would be just as rich as he is. And then we found out that his loans were he was making loans, and they were being supported by HUD, by the Housing and Urban Development people. HUD, of course, is supposed to be for low-income people, but here Sean Hannity was having his loans supported by HUD funds, which is illegal, of course. And of course, something's going to come up from this in the future, I'm sure. People tend to respect the competence of those high in status, and like those who agreeably accept the lower status, they like people that know who they are and where they're supposed to be. If somebody gets uppity, if somebody tries to change their status, of course, then they don't like that select individual. If somebody wants to change and be better, as strange as that may seem. Religion and prejudice studies in the 1900s found that church members expressed more racial prejudice than non-members. This was a study in the 1990s. Those professing traditional or fundamentalist Christian beliefs express more prejudice than those professing less traditional beliefs. In 1982, a study found that faithful church attenders were less prejudiced than occasional attenders. The clergy were the most likely to oppose Hitler and were the most likely to support the civil rights movement in the United States. So if we look at the people that were marching in Selma, a lot of them were clergymen, and a lot of them were white clergymen. They were marching for civil rights. The whole abolition movement was supported by the church, but not all the churches. Certainly not all the churches. Some of them would not allow their people to march.
I watched a movie like 2 weeks ago, and it says, "Look who's coming to dinner." It was like in the 60s or
Right.
so.
Sidney Poitier, Katharine Hepburn,
Yeah.
Spencer Tracy.
Yeah, it was a nice movie, but I was really shocked when I seen the servant, because she was a black lady, and she got upset at the black guy because he was gonna marry this white lady, and she told him, like, how dare you, what are you trying to prove, and it was, she was so
You're a handsome buck. Didn't she call him a
racist.
handsome buck?
No,
Yeah.
she did not call him a handsome buck. She called him I think she called him an N-word.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was bad, but anyway, so at the end they take off to a different country and everything, and it was a good movie, but I was just kind of in shock how the black people treated their own people, if they were succeeding in life,
Mhm. He was a doctor, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, he was a doctor, and remember his dad was a postal clerk or something.
You're right.
Yeah. Very nice movie.
And in the end, they had to leave the country in order to get married.
Yeah.
In some states, of course, it was against the law in the 1960s for black people to marry white people. It was known as miscegenation, so it was against the law. French intellectuals, black intellectuals from the United States, in order to find equality, either had to go to New York City and Harlem, where they could find equality, or they had to leave the country. They certainly couldn't live in the South, and they certainly couldn't live in select northern cities where there was a lot of prejudice. So this is especially right after World War I. They would move to Paris, and in Paris, of course, they found more racial equality. But of course, they also found the French people who speak French and don't like people who don't speak French. It was really bad.
Did you see some of that in the service?
I'm sorry?
Did you see some of that in the service?
The
Miss
miscegenation?
Yes.
What happened in the United States military? During World War II, the units were segregated until they ran out of troops. And at that point, they realized we don't care, as long as you bleed red, we don't care what color you are. So they started pumping all these black troops into the combat troops. They didn't have any black combat troops at that time. So they started pumping them into the combat units because they were running out of guys. They were running out of men. So they desegregated they integrated the ranks, but only for the combat. As soon as combat was over, they resegregated the units. In 1948, Harry Truman signed a bill integrating all the forces. It took 3 or 4 years. It took until the Korean War before it really took hold. But of course, if you've ever been in a foxhole with anybody, it doesn't really matter who they are, as long as they've got a weapon and they're willing to watch your back. And this is something that happened during the Korean War. So after the Korean War especially, we saw less and less racial prejudice. It became more and more difficult to deal with the bases in the South, the Army bases, the Air Force bases, and whatnot. It became very difficult to deal with those because there was so much racial prejudice, but still existed. And of course, the military had to support integration. They couldn't, and in the military, all you have to do is order somebody not to do that anymore. And if they do it, of course, then you kick them out. So the military became a bastion of equality, even in the 50s and 60s. Then, of course, there was still racial tension. You bring in new troops, you bring in troops from the South, you bring in troops from the North. You try to mix them together, and a lot of times there's racial tensions. When I went into basic training in 1971, they brought in, usually they'll bring in flights that come in. And so you've got one flight from Indiana, and the one that they matched us with was a flight from Missouri. Missourians are really kind of interesting people, or at least the ones that I ran into. Some of them were fine, but some of them were the most prejudiced people I've ever been around. It was really kind of interesting. But of course, being from Indiana, we were far more accepting of other people than the people from Missouri. It's really kind of interesting. Eventually, of course, everything worked itself out, because if you showed prejudice, then the sergeant would just come up and tell you not to do that anymore. And if you do that again, you're out of here. So people hit it. That's what happened. Okay. Anyway, so the clergy, of course, and we can talk about religions. Religions seem to support separation. And I've explained that before. I'm not trying to insult anyone, but if you're a Presbyterian, you think that Presbyterians know how to go to heaven. If you're a Baptist, you think the same thing. So if you're a Baptist, what do you think of Presbyterians? Well, you think that they're wrong, for one thing, and they're different. Gordon Allport sees the victims of racial discrimination reacting in 2 basic ways. Those that blame themselves tend to withdraw, to participate in self-hate, and aggress against one's own group. And of course, when Andrea was talking about guess who's coming to dinner, the black servants were, of course, this is exactly what they were doing. They couldn't see beyond their own lives. They felt that the individual was trying to promote himself by marrying somebody from another economic level. Those that blame external causes tend to fight back, to maintain a suspicious attitude, and increase group pride. And of course, this is what happened during the Civil Rights Movement. One of the things that they had to do, initially what they had to do, was they had to get black people to like themselves. They had been denigrated in the United States for such an extended length of time. They had to promote things like, they had a program called Black is Beautiful, where they explained to people that no matter what they saw on television, that black was, just being black didn't make you ugly. And of course, this went a long way to change the way that people thought. Of course, at the same time, the American Indian movement was taking place. It was about 10 years behind, but we saw the same thing in the American Indian movement. We saw the idea that American Indians were just as good as anybody else. And of course, that's what AIM was all about. It got kind of caught up in politics and got messed up a little bit, but eventually that was the bottom line. When faced with a situation that might be prejudicial, the individual being discriminated against may react to the possibility by performing badly and losing their confidence. This is referred to as stereotype threat. And of course, we see that all the time. If a teacher thinks that just because you're an American Indian that you can't do mathematics, and they maintain this attitude, eventually, of course, you're going to start believing what they believe. And of course, this is known as stereotype threat, which is really kind of unfortunate. Strangely, of course, I have suffered from stereotype threat as well. One of my problems in academia has been that I don't wear glasses. Well, if you read a lot, then potentially you ruin your eyes and of course have to start wearing glasses. And my son, of course, ran into the same thing. My son has good eyes as well, so he's a mathematician. He's not only that, but he's an athlete. Being an athlete, of course, people don't see you. You can either be an athlete or you can be an academic. You can't be both. The student athlete doesn't exist, as far as most people are concerned. And anytime they see somebody who is a good athlete and also a very good student, what do they say about them? That this is such an odd anomaly. This must be, an alien from outer space, that this guy is not only smart, but he can also play sports. So I ran into that over and over and over again while I was competing in athletics. It would have been easy for me to decide to change the way that I look, to start wearing glasses, to start dressing differently, to start acting differently, but I never did because I thought it was just didn't make any sense. Anyway, so that's a very minor thing as far as stereotype threat is concerned. If you're of a different racial group, of course, different ethnic group, it's far more severe than it would be for somebody like me. But of course, I know what it looks like. Stereotype threat has been demonstrated in experiments, a form of self-fulfilling prophecy, of course. And we have complained about teachers. We complain about teachers all the time. They have prejudices against select individuals. Maybe they don't like the kids that sit in the back of the room. Or maybe they don't like males because males are so disruptive. Maybe they don't like females, or maybe they only like pretty females. Maybe they don't. They dislike other females, or maybe they don't like people that are overweight. Everybody has all kinds of interesting prejudices, and so potentially they will communicate that to their students, and their students will start reacting to it. Humans are gregarious. We like and we need to live in groups. Of course, one of the odd things about Montana, if you live in Montana and you go to the Indian reservations, it's empty. then all of a sudden you'll have just a whole bunch of people all in one spot. So you'll be driving across Montana, it's dark as pitch, and all of a sudden you'll see this pool of light, and you come up on that pool of light, it's either a town, a small town, or it's an Indian reservation. If it's an Indian reservation, it tends to be a little bit more spread out. But the really interesting thing to me is that they build all their houses so close together. Not just the natives, but also the towns. I used to live in Harlem, Montana, which is it's right next to the reservation. But the people that set out the town, they put all these houses right next to each other. You'd think you were in New York City. If you buy a plot in Harlem, it's like a quarter of what you would have if you lived in a city in Indiana. They're really, really close together. It's just insane. No yards, absolutely no yards. They have all the houses are just jam-packed right next to each other. And they did the same thing on the reservation. They just built all the houses right next to each other. Why in the world would you do that? I mean, here you are living in Montana. You've got all this open space. I lived in a county that had 1.6 people per square mile. Yet, all those 1.6 people, they all lived right next to each other. I know, it was crazy. And then you'd have 12 people in a 2-bedroom home. What the hell is that all about? You got all this empty space, and instead of building a house large enough to put 12 people in, you've got 12 people in.
Yeah, like my stepmom, she's from Canada. One year we had so many Canadians in our house. I'm not kidding you. I mean,
They smell different, don't they?
even in the kitchen, there was bodies just laying on the floor,
sleeping on the floor.
all over the place. And I was telling my dad, I was like, "How come you like this?" And he was like, what's wrong, you know? And I was like, there's too many Canadians here, you know, you need to tell them to go back home.
Canadians smell like Canadian. They don't have any different smell. They're about the same.
Pineapple.
I don't know, maple.
Maple? It smells like maple syrup. I wish they did. Our sense of self is not only a personal identity, but a social identity as well. Social identity is the group that we identify with. Any description of ourselves can be a social identity in that we see ourselves as similar to those who have those traits. Without anyone to compare ourselves to, we wouldn't have an identity. And so that's what we do. We identify ourselves with the people that we are around. Which gets kind of interesting because, as I told you, I've been home a couple times, once for my 50th high school reunion, and then I went home for that induction into the Hall of Fame. But it was interesting being around Hoosiers again, because these are the people that I identified with, but they have changed. They've changed a lot in the last 50 years since I left to go to the military. So the identification that I thought I was making, it wasn't real. It just wasn't real anymore. Because the people that I remembered as Hoosiers weren't the same as the people that actually were living in Indiana now. John Turner and Henry Tajfel see people categorizing themselves, identifying ourselves within groups, and comparing ourselves with out-groups. So we see ourselves as, we need to identify ourselves. We need to know who we are. It's very easy here. You guys identify yourselves as Navajo. Potentially you identify yourselves as Navajo from Saley or Chinle. Potentially, because people in Tuba City don't act the same as people act here. Really? I was just talking to somebody and he was saying, you know, those Navajos from New Mexico, they're so different than we are. And I'm thinking, really? What's the difference? Well, I can't really articulate it. It's just that they're different. Is anybody from New Mexico? Are you good?
I worked over at Nappy. I totally agree. I agree.
Now, the funny thing is that when you talk to people, if I had a conversation with Francis and asked him that question about Navajos, would you tell me that? Would you say the people from over near the the Grand Canyon are different from people over here on this side? Do you know that that's true?
I would say, yeah, they're different.
You don't have to say they're different if you think they're exactly the same. All Navajos are the same. They all look the same. They all wear the same hat. You guys all seem to wear dark clothes, which drives me nuts. I don't understand why in the world you have to walk around at night with black clothes on. That's why I won't drive in. I almost hit somebody last time I was there at night. These guys are just crossing the street and they've got black clothes on. You can't see them. The only reason I saw the guy was because he looked at me, he had glasses on, and I saw the reflection off of his glasses. I'm going, whoa. And he was, I mean, I wasn't that far away from the guy, but he was in totally black clothes. It was nuts. Walking along the street, the lighting is horrible in Chinle. And here you are with a black shirt on and blue jeans on. Okay.
I used to wear black
And Travis is sitting right behind you with a black coat on, and he's got blue jeans as well. Identical twins. And so we've got Edison sitting in the back. He's got blue jeans on, and his coat is, what color is that coat? Black? Thank you, I was just curious. Oh, man. So is that how you identify yourselves? And then our Blackfeet friend over here has on a maroon top with lighter colored blue jeans on. And you had your moccasins on before, now you got your boots on. Okay. Is that what, do we identify ourselves by the clothes that we wear? Can we do that?
Kinda. Like a membership kind of thing.
There you go. What about those guys that wear their shorts way, way down so you can see their underwear?
Membership.
Membership, yeah, they're members of the cool guys, I guess. I don't know. We don't have that around here. We have to stop right now. We'll pick this up next time, and I'll try to finish the chapter. Maybe next week we won't have to come in. Won't that be okay? Or will it be okay? Will you guys be upset if we don't have class anymore?